Hey everybody, Karaoke here. It is July, and there is a reasonable chance that before the end of this year, so sometime in the next 4 or 5 months, Guild Wars 2 will get its second expansion. Now, there have been a lot of people that I've seen lately kind of dipping out of the game, things are slowing down a little bit, and people are playing other games. But me, for my part, I've actually been increasing some of my time in game, trying to prepare for the next expansion. In this video, I thought it'd be fun to talk about some of the things I'm trying to get done before the expansion comes out, and my reasoning behind those things. I'd be interested to hear from you guys as far as what you think you should be doing before the next expansion hits. Let's start by talking about things that I'm not really worried about, the first of which is mastery points. Our existing mastery points are Central Tyria and then Heart of Thorns based. I believe that we're going to get a new category of those that will be separate from Heart of Thorns and Central Tyria, and I also do not believe that they will continue to add new masteries to the old areas. Central Tyria is kind of a question mark for me, but I think that if they do add additional masteries to Central Tyria, they will also go back and add an equivalent or slightly higher number of available points. Right now, it's very painful to get some of those Central Tyria masteries if you don't have the Living Story 2 set, and I think that they've recognized that, and I don't think that ArenaNet is going to quote-unquote punish players by making them go after some of these very difficult mastery points. I think if they say, oh, we're going to add a new line and it requires 16 mastery points to unlock, they'll add 20 to 25 within core Tyria, making it a little easier to get those. So mastery points, not concerned about those. I also won't be getting any extra hero points, not because I think that it's unnecessary. Actually, I'd really like to get a bunch of hero points to unlock the new elite specs as fast as possible, but I'm very concerned that ArenaNet is going to change the way that hero points work, and that time invested in that will be wasted. I think that ArenaNet does not want people to be able to immediately unlock their elite specs just as soon as they get into the game, based on completing hero points prior to the new expansion coming out. So I don't know whether they're going to change this to be like masteries where there's, Heart of Thorns hero points for Heart of Thorns elite specs, and then there's new expansion hero points for new expansion elite specs. That would be my guess as to what they do, or they'll do the same thing that they did between Heart of Thorns and Core Tyria, and they'll just increase the number of points you get from doing one and the number that's required to unlock things, so that, you really can't just unlock your elite spec right away. I'm not sure exactly how they'll handle that, but I'm not going to wade into that and spend a bunch of time working on these when it's so unpredictable as to what they might do. And the last thing that I'm not really going to worry about is gold. Now, that can seem strange, right? Gold is super useful, you need it for so many things, but from my point of view, I don't think that earning gold after the next expansion comes out is going to be significantly more difficult than it is now. So I think there's a wasted opportunity. If I were to go and grind out a bunch of gold now, that's time I could be using for other things that I think is more valuable. Gold is great, but if anything, I think we'll have better ways to earn gold with the new expansion than we have now. So a real wasted opportunity if I were trying to earn a bunch of gold. Okay, so if I'm not worried about mastery points, hero points, and gold, what am I worried about? Well, the first thing is finishing some of the collections that I haven't finished already. Now, I had a very, very negative response to Heart of Thorns, and that persisted for quite a while, maybe a little bit longer than it should have. As I've been playing the game more a little bit lately, my view and my anger towards some of these open world metas has softened a little bit. I don't love them, but they're okay. But there are some pretty cool rewards that I had previously written off just because I didn't want to have to do that much open world that now I'm looking at and saying, hey, maybe I want these things. So for my case, I think that I'm interested in getting things like the Illuminated title, the Ex Machina title, the Jack Garrett mini. Those are all tied to doing a whole bunch of these meta events, and I've begun doing that a little bit more. Why worry about these now? Well, I think there's a very realistic possibility that once the new expansion comes out, you're going to see a lot of players leave Heart of Thorns. Not so many that the maps just are never successful, but just that success takes a little bit more effort, and you might find a little bit more frustration in doing it. I think it's worth your time to review the different collections that you don't have and say, hey, this is one that I want. Does this have any things that require successful hot metas, lots of successful hot metas, or potentially a large group of players to complete? You might want to try and do those before the new expansion comes out. Kind of an extra addendum to that is for the currencies that you get from the maps. So things like leyline crystals or the Aurelium, those are needed for the Gen 2 legendaries, for the Heart of Thorns legendaries. Well, we know that they're going to keep working on those and that they're going to continue to be tied to Heart of Thorns, not the new expansion. Well, if they release a new legendary in 6 months that you want, and you don't have that currency, there's no guarantee that they'll allow you to buy those shards that you have to get with the currency that comes from the new maps. You might still need to use Heart of Thorns currencies. So this is a case where I think it might be useful to stockpile some currency, because it's going to be a lot easier to go in and say run a bunch of successful careers now than it may be in 6 months or in 12 months. So if you don't have a bunch of extra map currency, it might be a decent time to go put some aside. All right, so let's talk about materials. Materials are a pretty big category, and there are so many mats that you could potentially buy and stockpile. It's honestly hard to even just discuss. There's just too much stuff. My general rule when it comes to materials is don't do any speculation. You might think, oh, hey, well, there's going to be new stat sets, so we have to craft new inscriptions and insignias. So why don't we buy silk and leather, which is used for insignias, because that's all going to spike in price. Well, anything that seems really obvious to you is going to seem really obvious to other people, and there's other people who are going to be speculating, and if there is any profit to be made, that's going to limit what you can do. At this point, it's already probably too late to start speculating for the next expansion, because people have already been doing this, because we know that it's coming out. So my rule here, buy mats for your own personal use, but don't worry about buying a bunch of mats because you think that their value might go up and then you can sell them. Now, the one area that this does really concern me is with guild hall upgrades. For those of you around for the launch of Heart of Thorns, you might remember that lots of different materials spiked significantly because people needed those materials for the guild hall. Now that applies to things like mithril and wood, which I think saw some increase, but there's some other really interesting examples as well. My favorite of this is seaweed. If you look at what happened to the price of seaweed when Hot came out, it absolutely spiked up because you needed a bunch of it for the guild hall, and it remained relatively high until they added a new farm for it in Ember Bay. Now the problem with seaweed is that it's used for crafting seaweed salad, which until very recently was best in slot food for a lot of different builds and cases. If you had a little bit of seaweed in your bank, you could have just crafted some seaweed salad for yourself and you wouldn't have had to buy into the more expensive stuff. But if you did not have any seaweed, you were stuck paying higher prices to get the same thing that you got before. Now, I think that that could happen with a lot of different recipes, so my recommendation is make sure that you have a good stock of different things that you use, especially if you currently craft with that a lot, but don't try to buy a whole bunch of stuff and then sell it later for a profit. Now, if you are really looking for ways to make money through crafting or crafting materials ahead of the expansion, I think the way to go is through anything that requires a daily refinement. This could be things like charged quartz or bloodstone bricks, dragonite ingots, whatever, the mithrilium or the silk thread stuff, anything that you can only do once a day. When the new expansion hits, if there's recipes that use those items, people will want a bunch of that, and you can then craft from the daily refined material into the final thing and sell it usually. So ArenaNet does tend to put in recipes that can help people craft and make money, but they almost always use those daily refinements. So keep an eye on those, make sure you have lots of the daily refined items in your bank, and you might have a good opportunity to make some money when the expansion comes out. So I never buy gems with gold, but if you're the type who does, then you might want to look into starting to put some money into gems. Once the expansion comes out, there's sure to be a bunch of items in the gem store related to new things that they've added. Think back to the gliders that came out after Heart of Thorns, and you're likely to see a bunch of people converting gold to gems to buy those. If you want those things, it would be better to have the gems on hand than try to convert when the expansion hits. Now, personally, I would always buy gems with cash, not with gold, although I do know that there's people who just don't have that kind of income handy. So if you're a gold to gem converter, make sure to do a little stocking up before the expansion hits. And then the last thing that I need to do, oh my god, my bank, I'm going to have to go through and clear some tabs because we know there's going to be new keys and bags and boxes and boosters and all these other things that take up bank space. So make sure you have some space in your bank to put it all there so you don't have to make those snap decisions on what to do about it. One of the mistakes that I think I made with Heart of Thorns was I would get these boxes of whatever, like a box of Viper's armor, and I would just choose a piece and be like, okay, well, I'll figure this out later. Oftentimes I was making bad decisions about what I was claiming out of those boxes. I think with the new expansion, I'm going to try to not make any decisions right up front. And if I get a box that I can open up and has a selection of items, I'm just going to try and keep it in my bank until I better understand what I want to do with that. In the first week of the expansion, there's going to be less information about what stat sets might be useful and on what classes and what the elite specs look like. You know, if you think back to something like Chronomancer, people didn't understand how it worked quite the same as they do now. I think that'll happen with a lot of the new elite specs as well. So I'd like to have all those things in my bank ready for me to select from them later, rather than having to make the choice, but that's going to require some empty bank space. All right, guys, that's what I'm going to be doing in the time before the expansion, trying to clear up some bank space, finish some collections, and stock up on certain types of currency, especially those daily refinements, so when the expansion hits, I am ready to go. Did I forget anything really obvious? What are you guys trying to do before the new expansion hits? Let me know in the comments below.